Hey everybody, how's it going? Over the course of my career, especially later in my career, and then more specifically after I retired and over the course of having this channel, I've had a lot of people ask me questions about my career, where I worked, when I worked there, what I did, yada yada, who I worked with, and I started thinking about that a while back. Started talking to my buddy Don Ehler, with whom I still have coffee at least once a week, and he's still working, and we started talking about where we had worked and when we had worked there and why this happened and when this happened, and it was really hard to remember because we'd moved around so much. And so I sat down a few weeks ago and started writing things down. I called Don every once in a while and said, "Hey, remember why'd this happen?" And it took a lot of thinking about things happening and things popping up. Oh yeah, I remember that. And so I finally got all of it written down. And so I'm going to share my memories of my career with all of you. And I want to start with this on the thumbnail, on the little picture that tells you what this video is about on YouTube. I'm pointing to a photograph in this photo album. And that photograph is me. I'm standing on a signal out by Oban. I don't recall what we were doing. It was me, and I couldn't tell who the other guy is. It looked like maybe John Sparks. This photo album was Bill Stokoe's scrapbook of the project that I was hired out to work on, which was installing CTC from Mojave to West Colton. I worked on the San Joaquin division, so I could only work from Mojave to Highland at the top of the Cone Pass. Bill was our supervisor. Southern Pacific's management structure was just the end of it I was involved with. You had a signal supervisor, and our signal supervisor's name was Charlie Redmond. He worked out of Colton. Then he had all the assistant signal supervisors under him, and Bill was the assistant signal supervisor in Tehachapi, but worked in Palmdale in the duration of this project. When Bill retired in 1989, by then he and I had become pretty good friends, and he was like a father figure. You can go back to my What I Thought About My Boss's video, one of my very early videos, and talk about Bill in there. I stayed in contact with him. I still lived in Tehachapi at the time, and would go visit him, and we were pretty good friends. I was friends with his wife. Well, Bill passed away in 1999, and when he passed away, his wife Betty gave this scrapbook to me. She knew how fond I was of Bill and how fond Bill was of me, and it was a very valuable thing to me. Is probably the most valuable item that I ever got as a memento of the railroad. My application process. I was out of work. I had been living in Bakersfield, and I was 19, and I've been working in the oil fields, didn't care for that, moved back up to Tehachapi, and one day my mom says, "Hey, there's the Southern Pacific Railroad's hiring." She knew I liked trains. When I was a kid, I had a little model train set, and I used to go down and sponge. I'd get the engineers to let me get up on the trains a couple of times while they were sitting there at the Tehachapi crossovers. And so she just figured I liked the railroad, and I really never thought about working for the railroad, but there you go. So you had to go down to the unemployment office in Bakersfield. You can go to the railroad office. I went down there, I filled out an application, and a very short time later they called me for an interview. And I went down there, and it was really a bizarre interview. I was interviewed by a guy named Gray Tisdale at the Bakersfield Signal office. He was one of the assistant signal supervisors. And when I left, I thought, they're never going to call me. What a weird interview, man. And so I went back to Ashby, went to work for a carbon black plant for Ashland Chemical out in Mojave, and worked there for 45 days and got fired. And I've never been so happy in my life to be out of a job. And within a few days, the railroad called me and wanted me to go to work for them. And not the following Monday, but the next Monday after that was May 7th, 1979, and that is the day I went to work for the railroad in Palmdale, California. And I went to work as an assistant signalman on Gang 7 for a guy named Rich Gollin. They were building these gangs at the time. There were probably about, I'll say 8 guys when I got there, and they continued to build these gangs, and eventually they had 2 gangs like this, 2 big gangs working out of Palmdale, and they both had about a dozen guys on it, maybe even more. They were big gangs. We did a lot of work on that job, a lot of work. I was young. I said I was 19 when I got hired. I really didn't care what I did, and I dug a lot of ditches. That's what I did most of. I never did any signal work. I think the closest I probably ever got to doing any real signal work was bonding rail, and I just worked hard. I got to learn how to run a backhoe. I learned how to run a cable plow, which is that piece of equipment right there. Did buried cable, camped a ditch, did everything. It was an awesome piece of machinery, and I loved operating it. While I got this out, while I have this out, that is Bill Stocco up there on that signal. I don't know what he was doing up there, pretending he was doing something, I guess. And then that is Roger Rico. That's the guy that took Bill's place when Bill retired in 1989. On May 15th, 1980, they abolished my job along with a boatload of other jobs. They entirely abolished Gang 9 and abolished most of the jobs on Gang 7. And as an assistant signalman, I did not have bidding rights, but I had bumping rights, and I bumped the assistant on the gang at Tulare on Gang 2, a guy named Phil Silva, with whom I later became very good friends. And we lost Phil in 2011 to cancer. It still bothers me. I worked for a guy named Jack Redmond. Jack was a pretty good guy. He was a hard-nosed, but he was all right. He'd see how far you could push him, and if you push back, he'd leave you alone. He just wanted to see how far he could push you. And while I was working in Tulare, there was an assistant who lived in Bakersfield named Mel Paleo, who was working in Palmdale. So every day we went by each other on the road. Well, not every day, because I ended up getting a little place in Tulare. But one of the bosses finally said, "Why are these two guys doing this?" Bakersfield's a lot closer to Tulare, and I lived in Tehachapi, and Tehachapi's a lot closer to Palmdale. So they let us swap jobs. Nobody cared because we were assistants. And so on June 30th, 1980, I traded jobs with Mel, and I went to Palmdale, and I worked for a guy named Greg Smith. Rich Gollin had bid off onto the new CTC maintenance foreman job, and got along really well with Greg. Greg and I always got along very well, and that was a fun little end of that summer. And on August 29th, 1980, I went home on that Friday, and my job, which I knew was going to be abolished anyway, but my job was abolished technically on September 1st, 1980. And I always say that I had 40 years with the railroad, and technically I did, but as far as compensated service, I only had 37 years. I was laid off from September 1st, 1980 till January 4th, 1984, and I originally planned to work until I was 63 to make up for those 3 years. But when I got closer to retirement and called the Rail Retirement Board and talked to them about it, it really wasn't going to make that much difference in how much I got in my pension, not enough to entice me to stay there for it. But anyway, I went to work back up on the Tulare gang on Gang 2. By that time, Jack Redmond had taken the tech job up there, and a guy named Randy Taylor was on the foreman job. And I didn't know Randy. I'd never met him. We never worked in the same places. I never even heard his name when I was working down in Palmdale. We were up there doing branch line crossings, and one day Randy handed me a set of prints, and all he knew is I had 5 years seniority and I was a signalman. He didn't really check anything else out, but he gave me a set of prints and said, "Hey, why don't you go over there and start wiring the crossing today?" Because he liked everybody to do everything. He wasn't one of those guys that played favorites. And I told him, "Man, I don't know how to read prints." He goes, "You've been here for 5 years, you can't read prints?" And I said, "Oh," I told him my story, and he goes, "Oh, okay, well, grab a shovel." Which was also, I was going to say before, that's the first words that my foreman, Rich Gollin, ever spoke out in the field that I heard him say was, "Everybody grab a shovel." That was a common theme in the first few years I worked at the railroad. But anyway, eventually Randy let me start doing some wiring, taught me how things worked, and started teaching me, and had a good relationship with Randy. In April of 1984, a guy named Doug McLean, who'd been on the Tehachapi gang forever, retired, and that opened up a job on the two-man gang in Tehachapi, the Peanut Gang. They can't call them peanut gangs anymore because it's not politically correct. Somebody might think you're calling them a peanut, but they did. They made us stop using that term. So I bid. A guy named John Sparks bid Doug's lead job, and this was a two-man gang. It was a lead man and a signalman. That's all it was. And a lead man was like an assistant foreman. If you're on a big gang and you're the lead man, you help the foreman run the gang, but you still had to work. So anyhow, on May 1st, 1984, I went to Tehachapi. I bid that job, exercised my seniority for the first time as a signalman, and bid a job, and was awarded that job on the Tehachapi gang. I went to work with a guy named John Sparks, and John and I became very close. And I was back working for Bill Stocco again out of the Tehachapi Depot, which is now the Tehachapi Depot Museum and the gift shop. If you ever go to the Tehachapi Depot Museum, the gift shop was the signal office. It was the passenger waiting room until 1971, and became the signal office. And that is, if you ever walk in that gift shop, that's the office I worked out of. On August 15th, 1986, I was bumped off the Tehachapi job by a guy named Bruce Shangarth. And I can't remember why Bruce ended up with an open bump. I went to Palmdale as the lead signalman on Gang 7 there, and Greg Smith was now the foreman. That was also the day Don Ehler, my buddy, had hired out in the track department in 1984. And on August 15th, 1986, he transferred to the signal department. His first day was on the Palmdale gang, and the same day that I got bumped over there. And he lived in Bakersfield and I lived in Tehachapi, so the first day we kind of figured like we got along pretty well. So he would drive to Tehachapi, and then we would alternate days driving from Tehachapi to Palmdale, and we've been buddies ever since. On or around November 1986, the Lancaster maintainer got in trouble and was pulled out of service. And I relieved his job while he was off. And that's the way SP did things. If a maintainer was, in this case, off because he was in trouble, if they were going to be on vacation, disability, if they're going to be gone for more than 5 days, they would always take someone off the gang to relieve the job. And that's how signalmen on the gang got experience troubleshooting, doing tests and things like that. And Union Pacific stopped that practice because they separated construction and maintenance. And it was a damn shame, because it was a great way to learn how to do things. Along about that time, Don and I couldn't remember exactly when, but it was while I was on, after I had started working the Lancaster maintainer job, our signal tech in Palmdale, a guy named Grover Webb, he decided he wanted to spend the last couple of months of his career just maintaining in a quiet district. So he bid the Solid Ed Canyon maintainer's job was open, so he bid that. Greg Smith bid off the foreman job to the tech job, and a guy named Ed Lamb, who was a friend of mine too, bid the foreman's job on the Palmdale gang. And at that time, even though I was technically still on the gang, it was Ed and Don Ehler and a guy named Art Gross on that gang. And one day I stopped, I saw the gang truck up at Ansel, and I went up there just to shoot the breeze, and they were sliding relays, which is testing the values on relays. And it's a mind-numbingly boring job. Takes a long time, especially in those houses out there on that old PMTC, which is what we installed in the CTC project with pulse modulated track circuits. It was a terrible system. It was problem plagued, and it used hundreds of relays at control points to make things work. It was ridiculous, and they all had to be tested. So anyway, I pulled up, and Ed wasn't there at the time, and Don and Art were arguing. Art wanted Don to do something. Don didn't want to do it. Don's a super alpha male. He's always been that way. He doesn't want to do anything that anybody else tells him to do. I ended up being his maintenance foreman at one time, and his wife asked me, how do you get him to do things? I said, you got to make him think it was his idea. But Ed pulled up while they were arguing. I was just standing there enjoying the show, and Art says, Ed, Don won't listen to me. And Ed goes, Don, go work with Mark. And I just figured it was for that day, but every day for the rest of that time that Don was there, he worked with me on the maintainer's job. So we got to know each other pretty well, got pretty close, and to this day, as I said, we're still very good friends. Probably one of the best friends I've ever had. Ed left the Tehachapi maintainer's job, or the Mojave maintainer's job, and took the foreman's job there in Palmdale. And John Sparks on the Tehachapi gang took the Mojave maintainer's job. And at that time, there was no one on the Tehachapi gang. And when that maintainer got out of the doghouse and came back to work, which was around, as close as we could remember, March of '87, both of the jobs in Tehachapi were open, and I think Don bid one of the jobs first, and then when the maintainer came back, instead of me going back to the lead job in Palmdale, I went back onto the Tehachapi gang too. I didn't want to commute to Palmdale if I didn't have to. So Don and I were working with each other again. In April of '88, Rich Gollin, who was the maintenance foreman, got fired. And when that happened, it created a bunch of open jobs. Maintainers moved to maintenance foreman jobs. Maintainers moved here, maintainers moved there. And when all the dust settled, I was the Tehachapi maintainer. At some point in '88, and again, we couldn't remember exactly when that was, Bill Stocco, who was another super alpha male, he and Don butted heads all the time. And Bill cut the Tehachapi gang off, and Don had to take a job in Bakersfield. Then in December of '88, I went off for 3 months with carpal tunnel syndrome. I had to have surgery. It was actually on this hand, but I had surgery and was off for 3 months. These things happened. What I'm going to talk about next happened around June, July, something like that in 1989. Bill Stocco retired. A guy, Roger Rico, replaced him, and Roger put the Tehachapi gang back in Tehachapi. Didn't need that many people in Bakersfield, and so he reinstated the Tehachapi gang. Don Ehler bid one of the jobs on the Tehachapi gang. Then Rich came back to work, and everybody bumped back and ended up on their original positions, and I ended up back on the Tehachapi gang with John Sparks. So everybody was back where they started prior to me being bumped by Bruce. And also at that time, SP was starting to get rid of jobs. One of the things that was happening at that time was that we were getting rid of the old code systems and putting in what were called PINA units, which is a solid state signal control system. And so they eliminated what was called a coderman down in Bakersfield. That was a guy who rebuilt and maintained the actual code machines. And so they got rid of that job, and they created another job, made the Tehachapi gang a 3-man gang. And a guy named Pascual Munoz came up and worked with me and John for a while on that. In October of 1990, I was relieving the Mojave maintainer, who at that time was Ed Lamb again. And I had to go do a P test, and I knew I was going to be dirty. There was no doubt. So I went and did my P test, and then I went to a drug treatment program. And so when I came back, the Tehachapi maintainer had been taken off his job for some reason. We thought we remembered, but we couldn't be sure. But anyway, he was out of service, so I bid the job temporary while he was off. And this was still during a great time of change at Southern Pacific. They were still getting rid of the code machines. That was an ongoing project. They were cutting branch line maintainers off and extending mainline maintainers onto branches, extending the lengths of some of the districts on the main lines. It was very tumultuous. There was a lot of craziness going on. During that time, I was able to hold on to the Tehachapi maintainer's job, and I held on to it until around March of 1991. And I was bumped off of that job by my old buddy Bob Hollett, and I went back on to the three-man Tehachapi gang with Bruce Shane Garth and Art Gross. And I worked on the gang until November of 92. Now, Don and I know that a couple of things happened in between there where people moved around, but we couldn't remember exactly what, so I'm not going to go into it. But I know that in November of 1992, the Palmdale gang foreman job came open, and I bid that. That was my first foreman's job. And I was on that job until August of 93. They abolished the Palmdale gang entirely, just got rid of it. And I went to Bakersfield. At that time, the maintenance foreman job in Bakersfield had just opened up, so I bid that job. And it was a temporary job. It happened because the tech in Bakersfield had gone off on disability. The maintenance foreman had bid his job temporarily. They didn't know if that guy was going to come back. So temporary jobs came up every 6 months. And if the person didn't come back within, I can't remember, if it was a year and a half, they put it up permanent. But as it turned out, this guy wasn't going to come back. And in the meantime, in November of 93, I moved from Tehachapi to Bakersfield. It just really wasn't practical for me to live in Tehachapi anymore. I was tired of living there anyway. I'd lived there almost my whole life. And in March of 94, the maintenance foreman job came up permanent. My old buddy Randy Taylor outbid me on the job. He was the gang foreman still in Tulare, and so I took his open job as the foreman on the Tulare gang. And at that time, that was just after the Northridge earthquake, and the Tulare gang was already over there on expenses, and after the earthquake, the I-5 and Highway 14 interchange was destroyed by the earthquake, and 14 is the freeway that went up to the desert at Palmdale and Lancaster. So Metrolink, the Metro Rail for Los Angeles, started running trains up into the Antelope Valley into Palmdale, so the commuters who lived in LA could go to work. Southern Pacific ended up selling that line to Metrolink, and we got rid of the job that used to be there. And when Metrolink came into Lancaster, they laid their own track, and we had to move all of our stuff. And I can't remember now which side of the tracks we had to go to, but all of our equipment had to be moved to the other side of the tracks to make way for the new Metrolink track. And it was a big project. All the switches, almost every location had to be moved. And that job ended in August of 1994. And they decided they were going to move the Tulare gang. They were going to re-headquarter it in Palmdale after they'd abolished the Palmdale gang just about a year before that. And the first job we were going to do was do some work, put a come-out signal at a place called State Sand and Gravel. That is now a control point called Vulcan, out between Palmdale 2 and Wash. And we were out there surveying the site, figuring out what we were going to need to do. And I had the case open, looking at the prints, looking at the case. Don Ealer was out there. He was the Palmdale maintainer at the time. He was working on electric lock. The other guys had finished what they were doing and were waiting for me, and I hadn't posted a lookout. And my guys were standing out there on the tracks watching Don do what he was doing with an electric lock. Don was in the clear. And the high rail vehicle came by the track inspector, and he had his truck on cruise control, and according to him, he was doing paperwork and wasn't watching where he was going, and struck two of my guys, Art Gross and Dwayne Smith. One of the worst days of my life. They were both, I'm going to say we were buddies, but we all liked each other, and they certainly didn't deserve that. And I hadn't posted a lookout, which I was supposed to, and it was just terrible. They survived, but were both permanently disabled. With all the chaos that followed that, they hadn't decided yet what they were going to do with me and a guy named Tom Cianez, who was the only guys left on the gang. So I went to Bakersfield, and they just had me working with maintainers, and Tom went to Tulare, where he was from, and he just worked with maintainers up there. In November or actually in October of '94, they had the investigation surrounding the accident, and I was called to account for not having posted a lookout, and I didn't have an argument about that. And in November, I was removed from service for 30 calendar days, and I came back just before Christmas in December of '95. In December of '94, and then they decided, rather than headquartering the gang, that they were going to just create a per diem gang, and we generally parked our stuff in Tulare, but we would park it wherever we were working close to, which at that time was almost always in Tulare. And they had a guy floating around up there named Jim Chambers, and another guy named John Drake that was going to be coming from another area, and Tom Cianez, who had been working up there, actually transferred to the operating department and spent the rest of his career as an engineer. So I took the foreman's job on the per diem gang, and it was really cool. We really worked. We did a lot of work. There was only the three of us, me, John, and Jim, for a long time, and we were putting in crossings and burying cable, just the three of us. It was a pretty big deal. In August of '96. The merger of SP and UP was ongoing. Everybody knew it was happening. There was no wailing or gnashing of teeth or anything. We just knew it was going to happen. And in August of '96, when UP's rules and policies took effect, they headquartered the Tulare gang, because UP didn't do per diem gangs. So they headquartered the gang in Tulare and immediately put us on expenses in Palmdale. Go figure. I worked that job until February of 1997, when I bid the Palmdale maintenance foreman job. By that time, my boss Roger Rico and I had started getting along a little better, and then when I bid that job, it really cemented what became a friendship. Roger really liked having me on that job, and I told him, hey, I live in Bakersfield. Is it okay if I work the job out of Bakersfield? And he didn't care. In 2000, it was about in March, I think, in 2000, Roger Rico retired, and Randy Taylor took his manager job. I have a thing on one of my videos that I did right after I retired about why I never became a manager. Once UP took over, I wasn't interested in moving into management. Then in December, on December 24th, 2018, I published my very first dedicated video on this channel. That was the Oil City video. There were some that were earlier than that, but those weren't. Those were done for Facebook. That first video of the Oil City is even done in the wrong format, because I didn't know what I was doing. In February of 2019, my maintenance foreman job in Bakersfield was abolished. I bumped the Tehachapi maintainer. Don't feel sad for him. He hated the job and wanted to go back on his own gang and make more money. And so I bumped a guy named Hector, and spent the rest of my career as a Tehachapi maintainer, and retired October 1st, 2019. During my career, I was either bumped or had my job abolished 10 times. 8 of those times were at Southern Pacific. I was on disability 4 times for a total of 14 months, but as I said, I was never injured at work. I was laid off once for 3 years and 4 months and was never laid off again. I was out of service for 30 calendar days over my part in the accident with Dwayne and Art. Altogether, I spent about 5 months in signal training classes, about 2 months in safety training classes, and about a month and a half at safety conferences all over the place. And altogether, with the railroad, in doing all these different training and all this safety stuff, I got to go to Omaha, Nebraska, Reno, Vegas, Phoenix, Salt Lake City, Houston, Chicago, and in California, I did classes at Roseville, Los Angeles, City of Industry, Commerce, Colton, and Ontario. And I've never flown commercially on my own dime. The railroad has paid for every time I've ever flown, because if I'm traveling myself, I prefer driving. I'm not afraid of flying, I just prefer driving, so I can pull over and see museums and play golf. But anyway, that is my career in a nutshell. Well, it's more than a nutshell. That's a great big nut. If that's a nut, that's a coconut shell. But anyway, thanks for following along. Hope it was at least a little interesting. How did your career go at the railroad? Are you still working? Are you getting bounced around? After Union Pacific took over, I didn't get bounced around at all. I was never bumped again, and I never had my job abolished until right before I retired. But it was a fascinating career. It was a challenging job, and I absolutely loved being a signalman. I really did. Because this shirt a while back, I'm a signalman. I don't remember what it says on the bottom. Let's see. I solve problems you don't know you have in ways you can't understand. And that is the absolute truth. Most people have absolutely no idea that the signal department even exists. So it was a great career. I have no regrets. I don't regret never being a manager. I don't regret any of it. I had a good career. I'm glad it's over. I'm glad I really enjoy retirement, even with the health issues I've had with COVID, and I had to have my right shoulder rebuilt and my left forearm, and it's been a wreck, but it still beats working. All right. As I said, how did you like your career? How do you still like your career? What do you think? Did you ever work for UP or any of the other companies before a merger took place that folded you into Union Pacific, BNSF, CSX, or Norfolk Southern? All right, let me know in the comments below. Shoot me an email, motorpoet59@gmail.com. Like, share, subscribe, click on the bell if you want to be notified of future content. See you all later.